The Quiet Stranger. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Middleton City, where the streets buzzed with life. Pedestrians shuffled along the sidewalks, carrying the burdens of their day: briefcases, grocery bags, and hurried expressions. Amidst the vibrant chaos, no one seemed to notice the figure sitting on a worn bench by the park's edge. The man blended into the scenery like an old, forgotten mural. His dark coat, frayed at the edges, hung loosely over his broad shoulders, and his baseball cap shielded his face from the piercing glare of the sun. From a distance, he appeared unremarkable, just another down-on-his-luck drifter in a city that swallowed lies whole. But for anyone who looked closer, his stillness was unnerving. His posture was upright, almost military-like, and his hands rested calmly on his knees. He wasn't fidgeting like the nervous types or slumped over like the defeated ones. He was simply waiting. Across the street, Officer Derek Malone finished his coffee and crumpled the empty cup, tossing it into a trash bin with a casual flick of his wrist. He straightened his patrol cap and adjusted his belt, the holstered gun resting snugly on his hip. Derek had been on the force for 8 years, long enough to feel confident in his authority, but not long enough to recognize the cracks forming in his perspective. Malone scanned the area with a practiced eye, his gaze landing on the man by the bench. Something about him irked the officer, not his appearance, but the aura of calm he projected. Derek hated calm. It meant people weren't afraid of him, and fear was the foundation of respect in his mind. With a huff, he crossed the street, his boots clacking against the pavement. The man didn't flinch or even look up as Derek approached. "You can't sit here," Derek barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "This is public property, not your living room." The man tilted his head slightly, as if he'd heard a bird chirp, but he didn't respond. Derek took a step closer, his shadow falling over the seated figure. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Get up and move along." Finally, the man raised his head, revealing a face marked by age and experience. His dark eyes, sharp and discerning, locked onto Derek's with a piercing intensity. The man said nothing, but his gaze was enough to make Derek hesitate, a momentary falter that only fueled his irritation. "I said move," Derek growled, stepping even closer. "This isn't your spot to loiter." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Didn't realize the benches came with reserved seating," he said quietly, his voice steady and measured. Derek stiffened, caught off guard by the man's calm demeanor. Most people would apologize, maybe even stammer out an excuse. But this guy, he wasn't playing along. "Don't get smart with me," Derek snapped, his tone hardening. "This is my beat, and I don't want to see you here again." The man leaned back slightly, his expression unchanging. "Your beat. Last I checked, this city didn't belong to anyone." Derek's jaw tightened. "You want to spend the night in a cell, because that's where you're headed if you don't get moving." The man exhaled slowly, as if contemplating the offer. Then, to Derek's surprise, he stood up, not hurriedly, not in submission, but with deliberate ease. Now standing, he towered over Derek by a couple of inches, his frame imposing yet controlled. "Is this how you treat everyone?" the man asked, his voice calm but edged with a quiet intensity. "Or just the ones who look like me?" Derek bristled, his face flushing red. "Don't play the race card with me," he spat. "I'm just doing my job." "Are you?" the man countered. His tone was soft, but carried the weight of a challenge. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like you're playing a power game." The crowd around them had grown, though most kept their distance, pretending not to notice. A few, however, had pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. Derek's anger simmered as he noticed a woman holding her phone steady, the camera pointed squarely at him. He hated being on the other side of the lens. "You think you're clever, huh?" Derek snarled, his hand inching toward the baton on his belt. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the gap between them. His eyes, dark and unyielding, bore into Derek's with a quiet ferocity. "No," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with." Derek hesitated, his hand frozen mid-reach. There was something in the man's tone, something cold and deliberate, that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was uncertainty. For the first time in years, Derek felt like he wasn't in control. "Are you threatening me?" Derek demanded, his voice rising in pitch. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Not at all. I don't need to." Before Derek could respond, the man reached into his coat pocket. Derek's hand flew to his gun, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Stop. Hands where I can see them," Derek shouted, his voice trembling. The man paused, his hand still in his pocket. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a slim leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed under the sunlight. But it wasn't a police badge. It was federal. Derek's breath caught in his throat as he read the words embossed on the badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below it was a name he didn't recognize but would never forget after today. "I told you," the man said, his voice as calm as ever. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The onlookers murmured in disbelief, the tension in the air palpable. Derek stared at the badge, his mind racing. How could this be? This guy was just another homeless nobody, wasn't he? The man stepped back, giving Derek just enough space to realize how exposed he was. "This city doesn't belong to you," the man said quietly, slipping the badge back into his coat. "And it's about time someone reminded you of that." Without another word, the man turned and walked away, leaving Derek standing frozen in the middle of the street. The crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, their cameras still trained on the shaken officer. For the first time in his career, Derek Malone felt powerless, and it was a feeling he wasn't likely to forget. The ripple effect. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Officer Derek Malone remained rooted to the spot, his mind racing. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only the faint murmur of traffic and the occasional honk of a distant car horn. The man's parting words replayed in Derek's mind like a haunting echo. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Derek's chest tightened. Who was that guy? An undercover FBI agent posing as a homeless man. Was this a setup, or had he just stumbled into something far bigger than his small corner of the city? Shaking his head, Derek retreated to his patrol car parked a block away. Slamming the door shut, he stared blankly at the steering wheel. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists to steady himself. The badge, the calm authority in the man's voice. It didn't make sense. Why would an FBI agent be sitting on a park bench, blending in like one of the city's forgotten souls? Grabbing the radio, Derek hesitated before pressing the button. Reporting this could either save his skin or ruin him entirely. The Internal Affairs Department wasn't known for its sympathy, especially not when camera footage might already be circulating online. With a deep breath, he made his decision. "Dispatch, this is Officer Malone. I need to file an incident report. Unusual circumstances." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that, Officer Malone. Return to the precinct and report to your supervisor." Derek's stomach churned as he started the engine. The drive back felt longer than usual, the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. He didn't know it yet, but the events of that afternoon were already setting off ripples that would change his life and his career forever. At the same time, across town, the man who had shaken Derek's world walked into a modest office building. The sign outside read, "Community Outreach Initiative," an unassuming name for a place brimming with purpose. Inside, the man removed his cap, revealing closely cropped gray hair and a face etched with years of experience. "Agent Carter." A young woman greeted him as he entered. Her desk was cluttered with files, coffee cups, and a laptop displaying a spreadsheet. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Carter smiled faintly. Change of plans, Sarah. Is the director in? Sarah nodded, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hallway. He's in his office. Something happened. Carter didn't answer immediately. Let's just say the fieldwork reminded me why we do what we do. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly against the linoleum floor. The door to the director's office was slightly ajar, and he knocked twice before pushing it open. Director Paul Ramirez, a broad-shouldered man with a kind but serious demeanor, looked up from a stack of papers. Carter, back already. What's the situation? Carter closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Ramirez. I had an interesting run-in with a local cop today. Thought it was worth reporting directly. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowing. What kind of run-in? Carter recounted the encounter in precise detail, leaving nothing out. The officer's initial hostility, the physical escalation, and the way the situation de-escalated once he revealed his badge. Ramirez listened intently, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. This isn't just about one bad cop, Carter concluded. It's about a system that enables people like him to act with impunity, but I think we can turn this into an opportunity. Ramirez tapped a pen against his desk, considering Carter's words. You're thinking this could be a case for broader reform. Exactly, Carter said. The way he reacted when I revealed my badge, it wasn't fear of me, Paul. It was fear of accountability. He knew he'd been caught, and he knew there were witnesses. If we handle this right, we can shine a light on behaviors like his and push for real change. Ramirez nodded slowly. Do you have any evidence of the encounter? Carter smirked. Plenty. The crowd had cameras out, and I made sure to keep my movements measured. No one can claim I was the aggressor. Plus, I've got contacts in the precinct. If we need to dig deeper into Malone's history, we can. Ramirez leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. This could be risky, Carter. If the media gets a hold of this, it might backfire. People will accuse us of entrapment or say we're targeting the police. Carter's expression hardened. We're not targeting the police. We're targeting injustice. There's a difference, and if we back down now, we let people like Malone keep thinking they're untouchable. The room fell silent for a moment as Ramirez weighed the implications. Finally, he nodded. All right. Start gathering the evidence. I'll loop in our legal team to make sure we're covered. But be careful, Carter. This is going to ruffle some feathers. Carter stood, his posture confident. I wouldn't have it any other way. Back at the precinct, Derek Malone sat in the conference room, his supervisor's gaze boring into him. Captain Maria Hernandez was known for her no-nonsense approach, and today was no exception. You want to tell me what the hell happened out there, Malone? She asked, her tone sharp. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't know he was FBI. He looked like a vagrant, just another homeless guy loitering where he shouldn't. Hernandez leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And you thought the best way to handle that was to kick him. Derek's face reddened. I lost my temper, but he was being defiant, Captain. He didn't respect my authority. Hernandez's eyes narrowed. Authority doesn't give you the right to use excessive force, Malone. You're supposed to de-escalate situations, not escalate them. He was provoking me, Derek argued. And how was I supposed to know he was undercover? Hernandez sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. That's the point, Malone. You didn't know. And now we're in damage control mode because there's footage of you losing it on an FBI agent. Do you have any idea how bad this could get? Derek opened his mouth to respond, but Hernandez cut him off. I don't want excuses. I want solutions. Until this is resolved, you're off active duty. Hand over your badge and your weapon. The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut. Captain, you can't. I can, and I am, Hernandez said firmly. Consider yourself lucky I'm not firing you outright. Now get out of my office. Derek stood slowly, the weight of the day pressing down on him. As he handed over his badge and gun, a sinking realization began to take hold. His life, his career, and his reputation were all hanging by a thread. And it was a thread he might not be able to save. Unveiling the shadows, Agent Carter sat in the dimly lit room of his modest apartment. The evening light filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the walls. On the table before him lay a stack of neatly organized files, a steaming cup of coffee, and a weathered leather journal. Each item was a piece of his methodical routine, a habit born from years of working undercover in environments where a single slip could mean disaster. He opened his journal, flipping past pages filled with meticulous notes. Dates, times, observations, and names. Carter's work wasn't just about chasing criminals. It was about understanding the systems that bred them. He had spent years unraveling networks of corruption, studying the cracks where abuse of power festered. But this time, the situation felt different. It wasn't an organized crime syndicate or a terrorist cell. It was a single, self-righteous officer who symbolized something much larger. Carter's past. Carter hadn't always been an FBI agent. Decades earlier, he was a young, idealistic police officer in a small southern town. Back then, he believed in the nobility of the badge, in the power of the law to bring about justice. But the system taught him otherwise. He remembered the first time he saw a superior officer falsify a report to protect another cop who had beaten a suspect. He had protested, only to be told, "That's how things work around here." Years of watching the same patterns, abuse swept under the rug, victims silenced, and perpetrators rewarded, had eroded his faith. He left the force, determined to find a way to challenge the rot from the inside. Joining the FBI had given him that chance. But even within the Bureau, the fight was uphill. Corruption wasn't confined to one department or one city. It was systemic. The encounter with Officer Malone earlier that day had stirred memories Carter preferred to keep buried. Malone's arrogance, the blatant disregard for accountability. It was the same poison he'd seen before. But this time, Carter had the power to fight back. The research begins. Carter picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." "It's Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I need a background check on a local officer, Derek Malone, Middleton City PD. See what you can dig up." The man on the other end chuckled. "Going after another one of your projects. You could call it that. Just send me everything. Records, complaints, anything that stands out." "Got it. You'll have it by morning." Carter hung up, his thoughts already racing. He knew there was a pattern. There always was. Officers like Malone didn't act in isolation. They were either emboldened by their peers or protected by the system. His job was to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. Malone's turmoil. Meanwhile, Derek Malone sat in his dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The TV played in the background, but he wasn't paying attention. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the day. He had replayed the encounter with Carter over and over in his mind, each time feeling a mix of anger, shame, and confusion. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of his colleagues, Officer Dan Carter, not related to the FBI agent, who was known for his loyalty to the force's unwritten code of silence. "Dan, saw the footage. Don't worry, man. We've got your back." Derek frowned, unsure whether to feel comforted or more anxious. The footage. He hadn't seen it, but he knew it must be bad if people were already talking about it. How long before it went viral? How long before his name became a headline? He downed the rest of his whiskey and grabbed his laptop. Searching his own name felt desperate, but he needed to know what he was up against. It didn't take long to find the video, uploaded by a witness who had captioned it, "Homeless man stands up to abusive cop, and he's FBI." Derek clicked play, his stomach sinking as he watched himself on the screen. The video showed everything: his aggressive approach, the kick, the moment the man revealed his badge. The comments below were a mix of outrage and schadenfreude. This is why people don't trust cops. Karma at its finest. Finally, someone stood up to these bullies. Derek slammed the laptop shut, his face burning with humiliation. The whiskey wasn't helping. He needed a plan, a way to salvage his career and his reputation. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about the video. It was about the choices he had made, the shortcuts he had taken, and the power he had abused. The first thread unravels. The next morning, Carter received an email from his contact. The subject line read, "Malone dossier." Carter opened it, scanning the contents quickly. As he expected, Derek Malone had a history. Excessive force complaints. 5 in the past 3 years, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. Civilian interactions. Multiple accusations of racial profiling, none of which had led to formal discipline. Internal reviews. 1 suspension for insubordination, served quietly and without public notice. Carter leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. This wasn't just about Malone. The dismissals, the lack of accountability. It pointed to a culture that protected its own at the expense of the public. He picked up his phone and called Ramirez. "I got something," Carter said when the director answered. "Malone's record is a goldmine of systemic failure. If we play this right, we can make this more than just a personal accountability case. We can highlight the need for real reform." Ramirez was silent for a moment. "You sure about this, Carter? Taking on an entire department isn't exactly subtle." "It's not about being subtle," Carter replied. "It's about being effective. This is bigger than one cop." Ramirez sighed. "All right, but tread carefully. We don't want this blowing up in our faces." Carter smiled faintly. "Careful is my middle name." The plot thickens. As Carter dug deeper into Malone's past, Derek found himself summoned to an emergency meeting at the precinct. Captain Hernandez stood at the front of the room, her expression grim. "Listen up," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered officers. "By now, most of you have heard about the incident involving Officer Malone. Let me be clear. This precinct will not tolerate misconduct, especially when it's caught on camera for the whole world to see." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his colleagues stole glances at him. Hernandez's eyes locked onto his. "Officer Malone, you're on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Effective immediately." The room fell silent. Derek felt the weight of his colleagues' stares, some sympathetic, others judgmental. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. As the meeting ended, Derek left the room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't realize it yet, but Carter was already pulling the threads of his carefully constructed world, and those threads were about to unravel completely. Shifting sands. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Derek Malone sat in the empty locker room. The smell of disinfectant and leather wafted through the air, a scent he had grown numb to over the years. Now it seemed suffocating. His badge and gun were gone, stripped from him like armor taken from a night before battle. The silence pressed against him, broken only by the occasional echo of distant voices in the hall. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. What had gone wrong? Was it really his fault, or was he just the scapegoat for a system that had encouraged his behavior? Derek hated feeling powerless, and yet here he was, at the mercy of forces beyond his control. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through the news. The video of his confrontation with Agent Carter was everywhere now, plastered across headlines and social media feeds. Each article painted him as the villain, while Carter was hailed as the hero who had stood up to systemic abuse. The comments were brutal. "This guy deserves to lose his badge." Finally, someone exposing bad cops for what they are. How many others has he abused who didn't have a badge to protect them? Derek clenched his jaw, tossing the phone onto the bench beside him. He didn't need the public to tell him what he already feared. His career might be over. Carter's investigation deepens. On the other side of town, Agent Carter sat in the community center's meeting room, surrounded by stacks of files and a handful of trusted colleagues. They were a mix of community leaders, legal experts and former officers who had left the force disillusioned but determined to make a difference. Carter held up a sheet of paper, his voice steady but laced with determination. Here's what we know so far. Officer Derek Malone has a history of excessive force complaints and racial profiling. None of these incidents resulted in disciplinary action, despite multiple eyewitness accounts. Why? A woman at the table, a civil rights attorney named Janice Ward, leaned forward. Because the system isn't designed to hold officers accountable. It's designed to protect them. Complaints are filtered through internal affairs departments that prioritize the reputation of the department over justice. Carter nodded. Exactly. But this isn't just about Malone. He's a symptom of a larger problem. We need to expose the mechanisms that enable this behavior, everything from biased internal investigations to inadequate training on de-escalation. One of the former officers, a man named Luis Alvarez, chimed in. You're right, but going after the system isn't easy. The blue wall of silence is real. Even good cops are afraid to speak out because they don't want to be ostracized, or worse. That's why we need undeniable evidence, Carter said. I've already started gathering testimonies from people who've had run-ins with Malone. Combined with the video footage, we can make this case bulletproof. Janice frowned. You're putting a target on your back, Carter. The police union won't take this lying down. I'm not worried about the union, Carter replied. I'm worried about the people who've been silenced for too long. This isn't just a fight worth having. It's a fight we have to win. Derek's awakening. Later that evening, Derek found himself at a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. The usual crowd of off-duty officers and blue-collar workers filled the space, but tonight, he wasn't here to socialize. He nursed a beer in the corner booth, his thoughts a storm of regret and anger. Dan Carter slid into the seat across from him, his expression unreadable. Heard you got suspended, Dan said, signaling the bartender for another round. Derek sighed. Yeah. Captain Hernandez didn't waste any time. Dan leaned forward, lowering his voice. You know they're making you the fall guy, right? They need someone to blame, and you're the easiest target. I don't need a lecture, Derek snapped, his frustration boiling over. I know I screwed up, but it's not like I'm the only one who's ever lost their temper. Dan shrugged. True, but you're the one who got caught. And not just caught by an FBI agent with the whole thing on tape. Derek's eyes narrowed. What do you want, Dan? Sympathy. I want you to think, Dan said sharply. This is bigger than you. That guy, Carter, he's not just some undercover agent passing through. He's here for a reason. He's digging, Derek, and if he finds anything else on you, you're done. Derek froze, the weight of Dan's words sinking in. What do you mean digging? I mean he's looking at your record, Dan said. The complaints, the suspensions, all of it. And if he connects you to something bigger, you're not just losing your badge. You're going to prison. The thought hit Derek like a punch to the gut. Prison. The word echoed in his mind, conjuring images of confinement, shame, and a ruined legacy. He had always believed he was untouchable, protected by the system that had raised him. But now, that system was crumbling around him. A call for redemption. As Derek left the bar that night, his mind was a whirlwind of fear and denial. He didn't want to admit it, but Dan was right. Carter wasn't just an obstacle, he was a threat. If Derek wanted to save himself, he had to act fast. But as he walked through the quiet streets, another thought crept into his mind. Maybe this was his chance to make things right. Maybe, instead of fighting Carter, he could work with him. Derek shook his head, dismissing the idea. Why would someone like Carter ever trust someone like him? And yet, deep down, Derek knew the truth. If he wanted redemption, he had to take the first step. Carter's next move. Back at the community center, Carter reviewed the testimonies he had collected. One in particular caught his attention, a young man named Jamal, who had been wrongfully detained by Malone 2 years earlier. Jamal's account was detailed and heartbreaking, painting a vivid picture of how a single encounter with a corrupt officer had derailed his life. Carter picked up the phone and dialed Jamal's number. When the young man answered, his voice was hesitant. "Jamal, this is Agent Carter," he said. "I want to thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to speak out." "It's not easy," Jamal admitted, "but if it helps stop this from happening to someone else, it's worth it." "It will," Carter assured him. "We're building a case, and your testimony is a crucial part of it. But I need you to be ready. When this goes public, there will be backlash." "I've been through worse," Jamal said quietly. "Just tell me what to do." Carter smiled faintly. "Stay strong. We're going to change things, one step at a time." The breaking point. The air in Derek Malone's apartment was thick with tension. A single lamp cast long shadows across the walls, illuminating the cluttered space, a stark contrast to the neat, orderly image he'd cultivated in his professional life. The blinds were drawn, and the muffled sounds of the city outside felt distant, like an echo from a world he was no longer part of. Derek sat at his kitchen table, staring at the open laptop in front of him. The screen displayed a detailed email he'd received anonymously that evening. It wasn't just any email, it was a trove of documents. Complaints, testimonies, and case files, all tied to his name. Each document was a piece of his past, meticulously cataloged, exposing every time he'd stepped over the line. The email ended with a chilling sentence: "You can't hide anymore. The truth will find you." He closed the laptop, his heart pounding. Carter's name came to mind immediately. The FBI agent had to be behind this. Derek didn't know how Carter had managed to gather so much dirt on him so quickly, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about the video anymore. Carter was digging deeper, and Derek could feel the walls closing in. Carter uncovers the system. Across town, Agent Carter sat in a conference room at the community center, surrounded by a growing team of allies. The walls were lined with whiteboards and bulletin boards, each one covered with notes, photos, and timelines. At the center of it all was a large board labeled Middleton Police Department, Corruption Network. Carter stood in front of the board, addressing the group. "This isn't just about Derek Malone," he began, pointing to the officer's name, which was circled in red. "He's one piece of a much larger puzzle. The system that protects him, and others like him, has been in place for decades." Janice Ward, the civil rights attorney, nodded. "The complaints against Malone were swept under the rug, but it's not just him. The Internal Affairs Department has a pattern of dismissing cases with flimsy excuses. It's a culture of complicity." Carter turned to Luis Alvarez, the former officer. "Luis, you've been on the inside. What's the motivation here? Why protect someone like Malone?" Luis sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's fear. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of public backlash, and fear of losing the trust of the rank-and-file officers. The higher-ups would rather protect their own than admit the system is broken. It's easier to cover things up than to address them." Carter nodded. "And that's exactly what we're going to change. We've already got enough evidence to take this public, but we need one final piece, a first-hand account from inside the precinct." Janice raised an eyebrow. "You think someone's going to break the blue wall of silence?" Carter smirked. "I think someone already has." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "I got this from a source inside the department," he explained. "It's a record of internal memos, emails, and meeting minutes. It proves that the leadership knew about the complaints against Malone and chose to bury them." The room buzzed with murmurs as Carter opened the folder, revealing the documents inside. Each page was a damning indictment of a system designed to protect its own, no matter the cost. "We're almost there," Carter said. "But we need to be strategic. If we release this too soon, they'll claim it's out of context. We need to build the narrative first." Janice leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "And how do you plan to do that?" Carter's eyes gleamed with determination. "We let Derek Malone tell the story himself. Derek's decision. The knock on Derek's door startled him. He hadn't been expecting anyone, and the paranoia that had been building in his chest since the email made his heart race. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Agent Carter stood on the other side, his expression calm but firm. Derek hesitated, his mind racing. He could ignore it, pretend he wasn't home. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't solve anything. With a resigned sigh, he opened the door. "What do you want?" Derek asked, his voice tinged with weariness. Carter stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the apartment. "We need to talk." "About what?" Derek asked, closing the door behind him. "You've already ruined my life. What more do you want?" Carter turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to ruin your life, Derek. I want to give you a chance to make things right." Derek laughed bitterly. "Make things right? Do you have any idea what you've done? I'm suspended, my name's all over the news, and I can't even walk down the street without someone calling me a monster." "You did that to yourself," Carter said bluntly. "But this isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. You have a choice to make, Derek. You can keep running from your past, or you can face it head-on and help us fix the system that allowed this to happen." Derek stared at him, his jaw tightening. "Why should I trust you? How do I know this isn't just another trap?" "Because I've been where you are," Carter said, his voice softening. "I've made mistakes, and I've seen what happens when people let fear and pride stop them from doing the right thing. But I've also seen what's possible when someone takes responsibility and chooses to be better." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Derek turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You think one person can change a system like this? It's too big, too broken." "It is big," Carter admitted, "but it's not unfixable, and it starts with people like you, the ones who've seen the cracks firsthand. If you're willing to step forward, you could be the catalyst for something bigger than yourself." Derek was silent for a long moment, his back still turned. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need me to do?" Carter stepped closer, placing a hand on Derek's shoulder. "Tell the truth. All of it. The turning point." The next day, Derek sat in a small recording studio at the community center, a camera pointed at him. Carter stood behind the camera, giving him a nod of encouragement. "Whenever you're ready," Carter said. Derek took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. The weight of years of guilt and fear pressed down on him, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He looked directly into the camera, his voice steady. "My name is Derek Malone. I've been a police officer for 8 years, and I've made mistakes, big ones. But I'm here today because I want to take responsibility for those mistakes and help fix the system that allowed them to happen." As he spoke, the tension in his chest began to ease. For the first time in years, Derek felt like he was doing something right, and he knew this was just the beginning. The ripple of redemption. The video of Derek Malone's confession went live at noon, hosted on the community center's website, and shared widely on social media. It began with the title, "Breaking the Silence. The police officer speaks out against corruption." Within hours, it had tens of thousands of views, the comment section filling with a mix of outrage, support, and disbelief. Derek's face, worn but determined, filled the screen. He spoke plainly, without embellishment or excuses. "I've been a police officer for 8 years, and during that time, I've witnessed and participated in actions that were wrong. I'm not proud of it. I justified it to myself as part of the job, part of maintaining order. But the truth is, it wasn't order. It was abuse of power." The video cut to clips of Carter and Janice Ward providing context. They outlined the systemic failures within the Middleton Police Department, how complaints were buried, how officers were trained to see the public as adversaries, and how accountability was sacrificed for the sake of reputation. Derek's voiceover continued. "This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a system that creates them, protects them, and punishes anyone who tries to speak out. I can't change what I've done, but I can help expose the truth. That's why I'm here." The public reacts. The fallout was immediate and intense. Local news stations picked up the story, replaying segments of Derek's confession alongside excerpts from the documents Carter had uncovered. The footage of the initial altercation between Derek and Carter went viral again, now reframed as the spark that ignited a movement. Protests erupted in front of the Middleton Police Department. Signs reading "Accountability now" and "Justice for all" filled the streets. Community leaders demanded an independent investigation into the department, and pressure mounted on city officials to act. Not everyone was supportive. The police union released a scathing statement condemning Derek as a traitor and accusing Carter of entrapment. Some officers within the department began leaking information to discredit both men, spreading rumors about Derek's personal life and questioning Carter's motives. But the tide of public opinion was shifting. Derek's willingness to come forward, coupled with Carter's meticulous evidence, resonated with people who had long felt unheard. The movement was gaining momentum, and it wasn't slowing down. Inside the department, Captain Maria Hernandez sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. The video of Derek's confession played on loop, his words echoing in her mind. She had always prided herself on running a tight ship, but now she was forced to confront the reality that her department was at the center of a growing scandal. A knock at the door broke her train of thought. She looked up to see Lieutenant Grace Powell, her second in command, standing in the doorway. "We've got a problem," Powell said, closing the door behind her. "The mayor's office just called. They're bringing in an independent task force to review the department." Hernandez leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "What did you expect? This was bound to happen." Powell hesitated. "Some of the officers are saying we should push back. Deny everything, claim it's a smear campaign." "And what do you think?" Hernandez asked, her tone sharp. Powell sighed. "I think they're scared. And I think they're wrong. If we don't cooperate, it'll only make us look worse." Hernandez nodded slowly. "Good. Then let's get ahead of this. I want a full internal review, starting today. And I want every officer to know that if they've got skeletons in their closet, now's the time to come clean. No more hiding." Powell raised an eyebrow. "You're serious about this?" Hernandez met her gaze. "Dead serious. It's time we cleaned house." Derek faces the heat. Derek sat in a makeshift office at the community center, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The media frenzy was relentless, and he had been advised to avoid public appearances for his safety. Even so, he couldn't escape the storm. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls, messages, and emails, some supportive, others venomous. He looked up as Carter entered the room, a file in hand. "How are you holding up?" Carter asked. Derek shrugged. "About as well as you'd expect for someone who just blew up his career." Carter placed the file on the table and sat across from him. "You didn't just blow up your career. You set an example. People are listening, Derek. They're paying attention." "Yeah, but at what cost?" Derek muttered. "I've got people calling me a hero and a traitor in the same breath. I don't even know who I am anymore." Carter leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're someone who decided to do the right thing when it mattered. That's more than most people can say." Derek looked away, his jaw tightening. "What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?" Carter's expression softened. "Change is slow. It's messy. But it starts with moments like this. With people like you. Don't underestimate the power of a single voice." The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the Middleton Police Department underwent a seismic shift. The independent task force uncovered widespread misconduct, leading to multiple resignations and terminations. Training programs were overhauled, and new policies were implemented to ensure greater accountability. Derek became a reluctant figurehead for the movement. He participated in town hall meetings, spoke at community events, and worked with Carter to push for broader reforms. Though the backlash was constant, He found solace in knowing he was making a difference. One evening, as Derek prepared to leave the community center, he paused in front of a bulletin board covered in photos and notes. At the center was a picture of Jamal, the young man who had come forward with his story. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Thank you for giving me hope." Derek stared at the note, his throat tightening. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. Carter's reflection. Carter stood outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. As he walked to his car, he pulled out his phone and sent a text to Janice. "First victory down. More to come." The reply came almost instantly, one step at a time. Carter smiled faintly, the weight of the day lifting slightly. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, he knew they would keep moving forward.